And what we'll be discussing first is this idea about honesty in engineering. So engineering codes of ethics, they promote honesty, avoiding conflicts of interest, and avoiding deception and dishonesty. So here are some basic terms here. There's lying, which is making a statement believed to be false or misleading with the intent to deceive. So just merely making a false statement doesn't mean that you're lying. Sometimes we make mistakes and say something false. It doesn't mean that we're lying. In order to be lying, you have to make a statement that's believed to be false, but you also have to have the intent to deceive someone. So this should be avoided in engineering, lying. Other things that should be avoided in engineering is deception and failure to seek the truth. Deception is, it need not involve lying. It can be, for example, a situation where you withhold information. You're telling the truth, but you might not be telling the whole truth. You might be, for example, telling the truth, promoting only the benefits of the product, but not saying anything about its weaknesses. So you're telling the truth that there are these benefits to this product, but you're not telling the whole truth. You're withholding uh, negative information about the product. And this is an act of deception. Even though you're not lying, you are trying to deceive. And failure to seek the truth is where you, for example, an example of this is using data that one suspects is inaccurate. So engineers should try to seek the truth. And let's say they're running a safety test on a particular kind of product. And after running the test, the engineer might think to themselves that maybe there was something a little off, or maybe they have some reason to believe that the test results are not accurate. Well, then this engineer should run the test again. So the idea here is to use data and keep running tests and the like to the point where one is justified and is meeting threshold requirements for seeking the truth. Okay, so next let's discuss the responsibility to be honest. So engineers, they are responsible for disclosing any factors that might endanger the public or the environment to the employers, clients, and public. There is an immediate responsibility for engineers to disclose such kind of information. There must be also informed consent for decision makers, such as in using a product. So let's say there's an engineers are working on a particular project, and uh, and this product, when advertising it or looking for potential clients or customers for it, there must be informed consent of letting those clients know about the relevant details of the product itself. And they should try to let them know about these things in an understandable way, at the right level of technicality in terms of usage of words. In presenting a product, there should be informed consent to possible consumers so they can have an understanding of the product so that they can make a properly informed decision about whether or not they would like to use the product or not. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to ask the question, how might utilitarians support honesty? What might be some utilitarian justifications for honesty in the engineering world? So at this point, feel free to press pause to think about this on your own before proceeding. Okay, so here are some reasons. One is that dishonesty erodes public trust in engineers. So if engineers are not honest, then this can create it kind of can erode public trust in engineers and generally in science. This, of course, would be an extreme negative for the overall good. Also, it can undermine informed decision-making by legislators concerning the public welfare. So legislators, for example, have to make decisions that can be in relation to engineering, for example, making decisions about public works, waters, sewers, roads, etc. And in these kinds of situations, if there is dishonesty from the relevant engineers, this can undermine the decision-making of legislators. in trying to make, for example, infrastructure kinds of decisions. It can also lead to harm to people and the environment, right? If engineers are dishonest and let's say they're dishonest about a product that actually is harmful to other people without properly disclosing this information or harmful to the environment, then this will bring a strong level of disutility, right? Qualitative as well as quantitative pain towards innocent human life. So this will weigh very heavily on a utilitarian calculation, and it should be, in most cases, avoided. Okay, so next, let's discuss dishonesty in research and testing. So here are some basic ideas and concepts. So the first one is in regards to the falsification of data. And what the falsification of data is about is it's distorting data by smoothing out irregularities or presenting only those data which fit one's favored theory, right? Kind of ignoring the other data that goes against one's theory or one's kind of interpretation or viewpoint. Fabrication is inventing data and even reporting results of tests that were never conducted. Plagiarism is the use of intellectual property of others without proper permission or credit. And plagiarism is a kind of theft. And plagiarism can even involve, for example, the use of ideas that may have in significant part come from oneself that is under the copyright of the company that one was working for. And then you go to a different company and then you try to use that same similar idea. There is a question here in regards to, or there's an issue here in regards to intellectual property rights because it's your former employer that actually has the intellectual property rights to that idea. So here's a case study. Let's say there's Jack, who works for an oil firm running test drills at various sites and explaining the results. And he realizes that he forgot to run a standard and important chemical test at a particular site. And it will require great expense to run this test again. And Jack knows that he will likely lose his job if he reports this omission, his failure to run this standard important test. And in this situation, let's say Jack has a pregnant wife and he is the sole earner in his family. And let's say also that only 1% of these chemical tests turn up positive. In this situation, should he lie to the oil firm? Should Jack just report that the test came up negative in this case? So I'll leave this open for further discussion in the forum posts and think about the various reasons and facts of the case as far as ethically speaking what he should or should not do. Okay, so next let's discuss confidentiality. And engineers generally should maintain confidentiality of a client's information. Right? If they're being paid by a client, then information that they gather should be kept confidential to their client, unless, of course, the client allows them to release it to various other people. And this is kind of a general rule that holds in more cases than not. It is possible that there may be exceptions to it, but let's look at some cases here. So in our first example, an engineer is paid by a building owner to inspect it. Everything is fine. So the engineer inspects the building and says structurally everything looks good. And the engineer gives the report, in this case, to the owner and the real estate agency of the owner. The owner never asked the engineer to give this report to the real estate agency of the owner. The owner paid the engineer for this report out of his or her own pocket. So in this situation, the engineer should not have given the report also to the real estate agency without the owner's consent. Right? It's the owner who paid for the report, and so the engineer should give the report only to the owner without forwarding it to the real estate agency of the owner without the owner's consent or approval. Here's another case. What if the engineer found structural defects in a building in which there are many tenants, and it's unsafe for its many current tenants because of it? The owner, right, who paid the engineer out of his or her own pocket for this report threatens the engineer with a lawsuit if the engineer discloses it to the public. And for example, lets the public know, lets the tenants know about this defect. So I'll leave this also open up to forum discussions for the forum post. And I look forward to reading your thoughts on it. Okay, so next let's discuss intellectual property rights. Intellectual property rights, property that results from mental labor. Inventors have monopoly rights over the product for 20 years. Here we have a first example in which intellectual property comes into play. Let's say there's an engineer, his name is Bill. Bill is an engineer designing tires for Road Rubber Inc. Slippery Tire Inc., a different company, offers Bill a better job and agrees that Bill doesn't have to divulge ideas for 2 years made at Road Rubber Inc. per Bill's contract. So Bill has a contract with Road Rubber Inc. that any ideas that he comes up with at Road Rubber Inc. he cannot divulge to any other companies if he ends up leaving for 2 years. So Bill has signed that agreement. But Bill ends up here, in this case, jumping ship. He takes a job at Slippery Tire Inc. And after changing jobs, Bill is pressured to divulge such ideas that he made at Road Rubber Inc. to Slippery Tire Inc. Because, and these are what the executives at Slippery Tire Inc. say, that's why we really hired you. So they say, the real reason why we hired you is to get your ideas that you made at Road Rubber Inc. We hired you, initially we agreed that you should not divulge this information and that you should honor your contract, but that's not what we really meant. In this situation, the real reason why we hired you is to divulge this information, so let us know what those ideas were. All right, so here's another case. Betty used to work at Road Rubber Inc., but now works for Rubber Boat Inc., different company. She comes up with an idea for making rubber boats that is based on her earlier work at Road Rubber Inc. and is copyrighted by Road Rubber Inc. So she comes up with an idea for making rubber boats, and it is in significant part taking ideas from her earlier work at Road Rubber Inc., where her earlier ideas are copyrighted by Road Rubber Inc. So Road Rubber Inc. has the intellectual property rights over those ideas. And in this case, should she just use those ideas without contacting her former employer, Road Rubber Inc., in any kind of way, or trying to get consent for them or letting them know? And in this situation, Road Rubber and Rubber Boat, these two different companies, are not even competitors. So what should she do? Should she just proceed? Or should she try to contact her former employer in this case? So in the first situation with Bill, Bill should honor his contract. Right? So contracts are morally binding in this situation. And so Bill should honor his contract in that situation. But what about this situation? We have different features here. Road Rubber and Rubber Boat Inc. are not competitors, whereas in the first situation, Road Rubber Inc. and Slippery Tire Inc. are competitors. In this situation, I'll leave this second situation in regards to Betty open for your further reflection and deliberation and thoughts as far as what Betty, morally speaking, ought to do in this particular case. Okay, so next let's discuss this other kind of function or job that engineers can have for society, and it's in regards to being an expert witness, providing expert testimony on a trial. And here are some general rules of expert witnessing for engineers. Engineers must have adequate time for a thorough investigation. So if an engineer doesn't have enough time to look into the case, the various facts of the case, to provide a sound expert decision on the particular situation, then they should deny the request to be an expert witness. And in being an expert witness, the engineer must not take the case if one cannot do so without good conscience. So, for example, if one there could be a case, for example, where one doesn't feel the need to withhold information, right? If one doesn't feel the need to withhold information, then that's a situation amongst other factors where one can have a good conscience. But if one feels the need to withhold information for some reason or other, it could be because, for example, there's a conflict of interest, then the engineer should not be an expert witness in that case. Also, the engineer should make sure that the lawyer is familiar with the technical details of the case, the relevant technical details, and that the lawyer can prepare the engineer for cross-examination. Right? It's important for the engineer to be able to maintain his or her reputation, and where the engineer is prepared by the lawyer for the standard kinds of questions that the other lawyer will probably cross-examine the engineer with, so that the engineer is fully prepared for this kind of cross-examination. Also, it's important that the engineer maintain an objective and unbiased demeanor at all times, especially when on the stand, not to try to show some kind of bias in favor of one side over the other, to remain emotionally and facially neutral in this kind of situation. And it's also important to always be open to new information that may change one's expert opinion. So even if there's a particular lawyer who asks an engineer to be an expert witness, and as the facts are coming out, there are more facts that are coming out that were not made available to the engineer, technical details that can change the engineer's position and side with the other lawyer and the other side of the trial, then the engineer should do so, right? So always quest for the truth and telling the truth in this situation, even if it means saying something in favor of the other side. So always be open to new information that may change one's expert opinion for engineers. Okay, so now let's discuss in more detail conflicts of interest. So conflict of interest, this is when an engineer has interests that tend to make a professional's judgment less likely to benefit the customer than the customer is justified in expecting. An example of a conflict of interest is, for example, when an engineer uses valves made by a relative when a different valve might be better. And with conflicts of interest, it's important to keep in mind that there can sometimes these biases can work subconsciously without the engineer's awareness. Right? The engineer might say to themselves, "Oh, I won't be biased. Don't worry about it." But a lot of these times, biases happen subconsciously without their awareness. And this can color and taint and bias their judgments to, for example, pick their relative's valves rather than a competitor's, even though the competitor's valves might be better. And conflicts of interest, it threatens professionals paid for their expertise from fulfilling professional duties. So engineers have expertise, particular kind of expertise, and they have professional duties that they have to fulfill. And having conflicts of interest threatens the engineer from properly doing their job, from exercising their expertise and fulfilling their professional duties and obligations. It can also undermine trust with clients, employers, and the public. When an employer, or when clients find out that an engineer operated under a conflict of interest, that immediately raises a red flag it should raise a red flag for most people that, well, maybe there's something wrong with this project or product that this engineer is working on or has fulfilled, given the conflict of interest. Okay, so continuing talking about conflicts of interest, engineers must disclose all possible conflicts of interest with clients and the employer. So those should be disclosed. Engineers also should not accept financial benefits, free material, or other relevant benefits from suppliers, because that itself can cloud their judgment subconsciously or consciously. And also, an engineer shouldn't accept commissions from a company that is also dealing with the engineer's clients. So we can have a triangle here. There's an engineer with a client, and there could be a company that's also working with a client, And this other company that's also working with the engineer's client is also trying to pay this engineer a commission, maybe for a particular job or project. Well, in this situation, this creates a conflict of interest because the engineer can then, for example, there are various possibilities here, but the engineer could perhaps subconsciously be biased to tell their client to always favor, for example, this other company in their particular dealings, right? So this itself can create a kind of conflict of interest where, let's say, this engineer's advice to the engineer's client could be one where it always favors this other company that is in other dealings with the engineer's client. Okay, so more on conflicts of interest. So continuing talking about this, so even the appearance of a conflict of interest can erode confidence of the public in the trustworthiness of the product or service. So it's important that even the appearance of a conflict of interest can be damaging itself, and the appearance of a conflict of interest should be avoided. Sometimes, though, conflicts of interest cannot be avoided. Right? There are exceptional cases. And once disclosed, companies must decide whether to still proceed or not. It could be the case that, for example, an engineering firm needs to use a particular kind of material and it's only being produced by one company. And it just so happens that there's a conflict of interest with this company in that maybe there might be relatives involved as far as decision making. And there are relatives in both companies that are relatives to each other, which can create conflicts of interest. So sometimes conflicts of interest may not be avoided. And in those situations, companies then must make a difficult decision as far as whether or not they should proceed in with, for example, using the products from a particular supplier. There might be ways around it. For example, with this conflict of interest, the engineering firm might hire maybe a third party that are not engineers that are not members of the company to perform their own tests and their own evaluations on that particular material to test whether or not, for example, it's safe or worthy of being used or not. And an engineer with a conflict of interest can be removed from decision-making as it pertains to the conflict. So even though there are conflicts of interest, sometimes they can be avoided. For example, if there's a team of engineers that have to make a decision, and one of the engineers in that team, as far as making a decision of accepting a particular kind of material from a supplier, one of those engineers, let's say, is related to, let's say, an executive at that supplier's company, then this particular engineer in this team of engineers that have to make this decision about accepting this kind of material from the supplier can be removed from the team as far as making that one particular decision in which there is a conflict of interest for that particular engineer. So this is one way to kind of eliminate the conflict of interest in this particular situation. All right. So with that, I believe that concludes our slides for this particular lesson. And I, once again, look forward to your forum posts on these interesting kinds of ethical dilemmas in engineering.